Ottawa, Paul McDonald is caught in the crossfire. The general manager of Bradford White Canada, a water heater vendor in Halton Hills, says he is already losing customers in the trade war with the United States. Paul McDonald says his Canadian company, which sells hot water tanks manufactured in the U.S., is getting squeezed by both sides in the ongoing tariff dispute. Rick Matinick, Toronto Star, his business, like so many that adapted to the reality of free trade on the continent in recent decades, straddles the Canada-US border. It buys steel from Sault Ste. Marie, ships it to Michigan for manufacturing, and then brings back finished water heaters to sell in Canada. But now the vendor has to account for a new reality of trade hostility, where in the U.S., under President Donald Trump slaps import taxes on Canadian steel and aluminum, and Ottawa responds in kind with $16.6 billion in tariffs of its own on a range of goods entering Canada from the U.S., including, water heaters. That means McDonald's business now has to pay the 25% U.S. tariff on the Canadian steel it sends to Michigan, and then fork over an additional 10% when its finished water heaters are sent back to Canada for sale, a 1-2 punch that McDonald calls an unintended consequence of the tariff tit-for-tat between neighboring countries. Article continued below. We agree there should be a retaliation, so long as it's balanced, said McDonald, who explained that his company's competitors in Canada aren't disadvantaged in the same way because their supply chains are set up differently. We feel there should be some sort of exemption or accounting for that, he said. Read more. U.S. files World Trade Organization complaint against Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Trade war, but we're afraid to ask. Bradford White is among Canadian businesses that, while generally supportive of the Liberal government's response to Trump's tariffs, argue Canada's retaliatory import taxes are causing undue damage at home. To counter that, Ottawa has drafted a $2 billion aid package to help Canadian businesses affected by the tariffs and minimize job losses. The government extended work-sharing agreements to avoid layoffs, and provided funding to retrain workers, help improve the competitiveness of Canadian manufacturers, and support companies in efforts to diversify their customer bases away from the U.S. Article continued below. But many businesses will still face significant disruption, having structured themselves over the years on the assumption that the border between Canada and the U.S. would stay open to the flow of goods, said Werner Entweiler, a business professor at the University of British Columbia who specializes in international trade. People are getting blindsided, because we trusted that the relationship between Canada and the United States would be one of friendship and cooperation, even if there are long-term disagreements such as the softwood lumber dispute, he said. This is all being upended by these completely unnecessary, counterproductive and destructive sort of tariffs. Pierre-Olivier Herbert, press secretary to Finance Minister Bill Morneau, said in an emailed statement Tuesday that the government will consider applications for waivers or reimbursements from the tariffs, after consulting with stakeholders and looking at each request through a special committee. The selection of products on the final tariff list was informed by the feedback we received from Canadians, as well as our government's internal analysis. Herbert said. We recognize that there may be specific circumstances where relief from Canadian surtaxes may be appropriate. Sarah Engel, president of the National Marine Manufacturers Association, has already written to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stressing that Canadian boat dealers are alarmed by the government's inclusion of recreational boat imports from the U.S. on its tariff list. She said upwards of 95% of recreational boats sold in Canada are imported from the U.S., and that the roughly 1,000 boat dealers in her association are now contemplating cancelling orders of new boats or struggling to find cash flow to pay the new import tax. Like McDonald and his water heaters, Engel said she wants Ottawa to exempt recreational boats from its retaliatory tariffs. We're going to see a ripple effect as this continues, she said, referring to potential job losses, closures, and higher prices for consumers. As a Canadian, I completely support and understand why we need to fight this tariff war, she added. This is about protecting Canadian middle-class jobs and our Canadian dealers, which are small family-owned businesses, McDonald, meanwhile, has written to the Finance Department to ask for financial relief or an exemption from the tariff. Until that happens, he said he expects to lose market share to his competitors. "We're doing the right thing as far as Canada is concerned," he said, pointing to how his company buys Canadian steel. "That's what really irks us more than anything." Alex Bilingual is an Ottawa-based reporter covering national politics. Follow him on Twitter, @abilinga.